Hey guys, I hope you're doing well today. Welcome back to Alfred's Basic Adult Christmas Piano Book Level 1. This video is Lesson 7, covering pages 14 and 15 in our book today, The First Noel. All right, so again, welcome back, and I'm glad you're with me again today. Looking forward to doing another Christmas piece with you, The First Noel, on pages 14 and 15. We just finished up Lesson 6, which was Go Tell It on the Mountain, and The First Noel really isn't going to be too much more difficult. If you look at the top of page 14, there is a diagram here, which can be a little helpful. It is telling us that we're going to be in the middle C position. Now that is always a little bit awkward, and I agree as well, because both your thumbs are sharing middle C. So when you see middle C in the bass clef, your left hand will play it and your right hand thumb is going to be out of the way, and vice versa. When it's in the treble clef, your right hand will play it and the left hand will be out of the way. And again, why do they do this? Well, for one, the middle C position actually is most often used for beginners. It basically takes a range of notes that covers a large span of keys. And remember that you're only kind of learning, you've already at this point learned within these two octaves. Your right hand really hasn't gone a whole lot above the G above middle C. And your left hand has played, in the C position down here, and of course in the middle C position here. So you're kind of right now restrained to this part of the keyboard. And so, long story short, when you have a piece, a melody, and it covers that many notes, they're trying to make it easier by splitting it between two hands. Now, on the other hand, it does make it a little more challenging because we're playing really close together. But as I've said in the past, that's really good because you want to get used to playing close together, because there are going to be times you do that in the future. Not necessarily a middle C position, but there are going to be times where the hand's going to play close. And if you ever want to do a duet with somebody on the same piano, you definitely want to learn and get used to playing close to another person's hand, because in that case, it's not going to be your hand, it's going to be another person's hand. So you definitely want to get used to that, because the tendency for a lot of us is we get uncomfortable when it's really close. We feel like they're going to run into each other, and we do want to stay apart. So that being said, this again is a good lesson, just getting used to that. Now the middle C position in the right hand, by the way, is normally these 5 notes. Now in this piece, we're actually going to have an F sharp. No Fs, all F sharps. Now, if you've learned key signatures, which at this point I don't think you have, it does say here use after page 49 in the Alfred's Basic Adult Lesson Book. I don't think we've played in the key of G there yet, or learned about the G scale or anything. So if that's the case, you don't have to worry about that. But I will point out that all the Fs, and by the way, they're only going to be in the right hand, all the Fs in this piece are not just going to be F naturals, they're going to be F sharps. So that's why it's saying F sharp in the diagram there, middle C position with F sharp, because all the Fs are going to be sharp. So when you start the piece, you kind of want to be in this position. Normally we're in this position, right, with the 4 on the F natural. But just anticipate that you will be playing F sharps. Now they'll all be marked throughout the piece. So every F we see will have a sharp in front of it as a reminder. Now because the piece is in the middle C position, and like I said earlier, it's divided, the melody is divided between the hands. That's what's going to happen. Your left hand actually starts the melody out, and then it goes into the right hand, and then a little bit back and forth. So that's nothing new. We've seen that happen throughout this book already, and we certainly saw that in the previous lesson. So that being said, I think I'm still going to take the right hand by itself. There are 3 beats in every measure. Now the first measure, by the way, is an incomplete measure. You see there's only a quarter rest in your right hand, there's 2/8 notes in your left hand. That just means there's 1 beat. So that is an incomplete measure. If you look at the end of page 15, at the very bottom, last measure, there's beats 1 and 2, that half note down there. So that makes the very first measure, the incomplete measure, back on page 14, beat 3. And because of all the 8th notes in this piece, we will be counting 1 and, 2 and, 3 and. So when you start with your left hand, which we'll do a little bit later, those first two eighth notes are going to be 3 and. Now your right hand doesn't come in until the second full measure. So the middle measure of that first line, and if you're starting in that C position, your second finger is going to be on D, which is the first note there. That's just a half note for 2 counts, followed by an E, and then there's our first F sharp. And then you're working your way up to beat 1, which is G in the last measure. And then we got an F sharp and back down to E. In measure 4 on the second line, we're back to D. So we've sort of done this starting on D, going up to G and all the way back, all by steps. In measure 4, beat 3, we're sort of repeating that again. We've got another E, F sharp, and then measure 5, we've got G, F sharp, E, and the next measure, D, E, F sharp, and then the last measure, G. And now here we have a big skip. We're going down to D, so that's a fourth, G to D, an interval of a fourth. And the last note on that page is middle C. And if you're waiting for it to resolve on the next page, it will do that in the left hand, but we're going to hold out. So on the top of 15, measures 8 and 9, you're going to rest in the treble clef, in the right hand. When you come in and measure 10, it actually is just like the beginning. So we've got second finger on D, and then we've got E, F sharp, and then the last measure, G, F sharp, E, and the next line, measure 12, D. And once again, these notes will get repeated. E, F sharp, measure 13, G, F sharp, E, next measure, D, E, F sharp, and the next measure, G, the same interval down to D, and we end it with C. And then the last measure is 2 beats of rest, and your left hand will play. Now, the interesting thing, the last measure of that second line, notice there's only 2 beats of rest. We're in 3/4 time. There should be 3 beats. Well, beat 3 is on the third line. But here's the little tricky thing. Now, this won't really affect your playing, but just if you're asking why are those 2 lines at the end of the second line, those 2 bar lines, and why are there only 2 beats in that measure? So the last measure, and you could actually do the math. If you look at the first measure of the second line, it's measure 12, and then 13, 14, 15. The last measure of the second line is measure 16. We'll look down on the third line where measure 17 is. It's not that first measure, right? So it's the second. So measure 16 is divided between the 2 lines. And the reason for that being that division, those 2 bar lines that you see at the end of the second line on the word deep, those 2 bar lines are not true bar lines. What they do is they end one section and begin another section. So you sort of finished up the verses, and then beat 3, which is the beginning of the third line, beat 3 of measure 16, that's beginning like the refrain or the chorus. So whenever you see those 2 lines, and notice it's not double bar lines. It's not like the very, very end of the piece at the bottom of page 15. That really, really thick line there, that bold line, that indicates the end of a piece. But when you see these 2 regular size bar lines, that just indicates the end of a section and the beginning of another section. So the last measure, measure 16 of the second line, you would be counting 1 and 2 and when you get to the first the beginning of the third line, you're on 3 and the left hand will do all of that later anyways. But I wanted to go ahead and throw that out there in case you were curious, like why is it doing that? Is that measure, are those 2 measures incomplete, or what's going on? So it's just dividing a section right in the middle of a measure, which is not uncommon. Now on the third line, the right hand comes again on measure 18, and once again it is a D with your second finger, but then you're going to jump up to G, and then F sharp, the next measure, E, half note, and then another E quarter note, and then a D to end that line. Down on measure 21, the bottom, you're going to go up to G again, followed by F sharp, E, D in the next measure, E, F sharp, and then G. And once again, we have our fourth down to D, C, and this time we're going to end the song with D and G. 2 notes played at the same time, 2 on the D, 5 on the G. So you can see the right hand is pretty simple and very repetitive. And there's a couple of skips like, G to D, that fourth. But a lot of the right hand is just working its way up these 5 notes. Just kind of back and forth. There's a lot of that. Now, we didn't go over rhythm yet, but if you follow the reading spaces to line and lines to spaces, that's a helpful tool to just kind of get you to the next note on the piano without even reading exactly what that note is. That's the benefit of when you read lines and spaces. So I'm not saying completely rely on that, but in this piece, especially with the repetitiveness of that right hand, that's another tool that you can use to help maybe simplify the learning process. So just remember, line to space and space to line. That's just the very next key on the piano. Now mind the F sharps, of course. The F sharp substitutes for the F, right? But otherwise, yeah, you're just moving up and down by steps. Now, I'm not going to do the rhythm yet in the right hand. I actually want to wait and put the hands together and then work on rhythm because of the nature of just how they work together. Because again, the melody is split back and forth between the hands. So let's look at the left hand at the beginning. Now, here's the middle C position. Now, according to the diagram at the top, you're not even going to be playing an F. You're not even going to use the 5th finger. So you're really just using these four fingers throughout the piece in your left hand. Now, the first note is a B, and remember, it is going to be on beat 3. So we got B, A, and then G. And we'll hold off on rhythms for just a little bit. After the G, you're going to go to A, B, and then middle C, and then the next measure you're going to rest on beats 1 and 2 and then you got middle C on 3 and. The last measure you got B, and that's a half note, and then you're going to go back to middle C. Now this sneaks up on us on the next line, measure 4. We're going to go to G and B. So think of it going from, let's see, the second full measure again, beat 3, you come in on middle C, and then the last measure, B, back to C, and then you're going to come back to B and G. So there's a little pattern there, if you will. So once again, beat 3 of that second full measure on the top line, C, and then B, and then you're going to go C, and then B and G. And when you continue on measure 4, you have C again. And then measure 5, B. And then beat 3 is C. And then measure 6, B again, C again. And then you're going to skip to A. And your last measure, you're going to end on B. On beats 1 and 2 and then beat 3, A. So there's a lot of back and forth between C and B. A lot of C's and B's. The only tricky thing will just be getting the rhythm right, but that won't be too difficult. So a lot of C's and B's, which I think will make it pretty easy. So like I said, the last note on page 14 in your left hand is going to be A. Now be very careful that your third finger is indeed on this A, because when you go to measure 8 at the top of 15, you've got a G and a B. Now, G and B surround A. So think about 3 on A. What fingers surround A? That's 4 and 2 on the G and B. So this is some good finger work right here. Okay, so it makes completely logical sense. Now, if your fingers have a hard time with 4 and 2 and playing it evenly, that's okay. That's normal. Just work on it. Work on doing it until you feel your fingers are getting stronger. Of course, the key is to having curved fingers like you're holding a ball, and that way you can dig those fingertips in and get a lot more control. Flat fingers, it's going to be a lot harder, and it's going to be a lot harder to play evenly on measure 8. So that's a half note on measure 8, the G and the B. Now when you continue on beat 3 of measure 8, this is just like the beginning, actually. And it really is this way for both hands. So this piece is very repetitive. These two lines are almost identical to page 14. So on measure 8, beat 3, you've got B, A, and then G, A, B, C. And then you rest in measure 10, the third measure for beats 1 and 2 and. You come in on middle C, and the last measure you got B, and then beat 3 is C, and then you're going to come in on G and B on measure 12. And it's that same fingering we even did at measure 8. 4 on the G, 2 on the B. The beat 3 of measure 12 is middle C. Now in the next measure, measure 13, back to B. Beat 3 is C, and then measure 14, we got B, C, skip down to A. Measure 15, you've got B. On beat 3, you got A, and then you're going to end the line with G and B. Now stay right there, because on beat 3 of measure 16, which now we know is the beginning of the third line, you're going to play B with your second finger. B, A, and then G. This is very much like the beginning once again. A, B, C. Measure 18, we rest and rest. But instead of coming on a C on beat 3, you're going to come in on a B. That's a little different. In the measure 19, we've got C and C on beat 3, and then measure 20, we got B. And then A on beat 3. 21, at the bottom, you're going to go back to B. And then C. 22, we got B, C, skip down to A. And then measure 23, we got B. And then we finish it with A. And once again, going from A with our third finger to G and B with 4 and 2. So like the right hand, a lot of repetition in your left hand. Let's put them together. And I'm going to integrate the rhythms here as we put the hands together. So we got our hand position at the beginning, which our thumbs are both on middle C. You can put one, probably best to have the left hand on middle C, because it's going to play first. It's the last note of the first full measure. So your right hand thumb is going to sit this out for a little bit. Have that fourth finger in the right hand on the F sharp. Outline that. And once you're there, we're good to go. So if we got 3 beats per measure, and we're going to count 1 and, because of all the eighth notes, first 2 notes, remember, are in the left hand, 3 and, that B and A. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 1. Now this G on beat 1 in the next measure is a dotted quarter note. We had these in Go Tell It on the Mountain. Dotted quarter note is 1.5 beats. So in this case, 1 and 2 and. The A is the and, the eighth note. And this is very, very common. A dotted quarter note is going to be followed by a half a beat, which is and altogether that makes 2 full beats. So that G and A right here are going to be 1 and 2 and. Now you're going to go right into 3 and with that B and C. So those 3 eighth notes need to be equal value. So 1 and 2 and 3 and then we're going to go right into D on beat 1 in the right hand. So putting that all together from the beginning, we got 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and. Beat 3 of this measure is the first time both hands come together. C in the left hand, E in the right hand. Now, the C in the left hand is a quarter note. You've got 2 eighth notes in the right hand. Remember to keep holding the quarter note when you go to F sharp. So it's like this, 3 and. Very important you don't lift too early. 3 and 1. So here we are in the last measure, second finger on B, 5 on G. So once again, starting on beat 3 right before that, 3 and 1. You're working weak fingers here, so you may need to practice that. Get strong with it. 3 and 1. And it's okay to play it loud. Now, this last measure is all quarter notes. Now, there's a half note in the left hand, correct, but there's no eighth notes. So you've got 1 and 2 and 3 and. Now, the C and the E, you're basically coming back where you started. So that means in the second full measure, remember, the first time we hit hands together, it's C and E. You're going to end the line with C and E. So we've got 3 and 1 and 2 and then 3 and. Now this gets a little tricky. It sneaks up on us because it's on measure 4 all the way over the beginning of the second line. This is a G chord. G, B, and D. That is a G chord in root position. It may not feel like it right away because we're dividing it between the hands. But if you know a little bit about chords, specifically a G chord in root position, that can certainly help. Look how it's structured. They're thirds apart. G to B is a third. B to D is a third. But where you're coming from is C and E. And another thing that can help is your C and E is going down to B and D. Now, you're also adding the G, yes. But two of these notes are moving down. So realize that. I think it'll be easier when we put all of it together. So that's a half note at the beginning of 4, that G chord. 1 and 2 and 3 and. Now when the hands come together on 3, that's the same as we had before, C and the E. 3 and 1 and 2 and there's C and E again on beat 3. Now going on to the next measure, we have B and D back to C and E. So it's very similar to what I was explaining from measure 3 to measure 4. Measure 5 into measure 6, we're going from C and E to the next two notes down, B and D. But on beat 2, we're going back to C and E. So it's just this little back and forth here on beats 3, 1, and 2, and. But then here we go opposite directions. A in the left hand, F sharp in the right hand. Third and fourth fingers. So you may need to practice that a few times. You feel confident about it. And then what's happening in going on into the last measure here, we're going to the next note up in both hands. See that? So F sharp goes to G, A goes to B. Next note, next finger in both hands. Now in beat 2, you've got that leap from G to B. G to D. You're going to hold the B in the left hand. And then beat 3, we've got A and C. So you're right here on B and D. You're just going to go the next two notes down in both hands, the next two fingers down, A and C. And then in measure 8, you're going to lift your right hand, not off the piano, but you're not going to play on measure 8. And remember, your left hand goes into that G and B with 4 and 2. Now, when you get to beat 3 of measure 8, you do it all over again. You've got 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2, 3 and measure 12, 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 1 and 2 and. So everything I just did from measure 8 through the end of the second line on page 15 is exactly the same. Only the words change. Everything's the same. Going on, so the rest of measure 16, which is at the beginning of the third line, this is the chorus. The left hand basically repeats the same notes you played at the very beginning. 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3. Now this is different than the beginning. In the beginning we had C and E. Here we go to B and G, very different. So you're ending with a second finger on D. On beat 3, B and G, go to F sharp, and then you're going to land on a very familiar C and E. 1 and 2, and play the same notes on beats 3, and then go down one note each to B and D. And on measure, this is measure 20, last measure. On beat 3, you go to A in the left hand right there. So you got 1 and 2 and 3, and measure 21, you're going to go back to that B and G. Back to that B and G. Different rhythms now. So you got 1 and 2 and 3, and still the familiar C and E. Next measure, down to B and D, back to C and E, and then beat 3, we got A and F sharp. You had this on page 14, so it should feel a little familiar. And then the last two measures, B and G, and then A and C. And then we have the big finish here, 4 notes. That's a big G chord is what that is. You got G, B, and D, and we're doubling it with another G. And that's the whole piece. So it's in some ways it's easier than some of our previous lessons, I feel. And a lot of it just because it's very repetitious. Now there's more notes that are being played together with both hands in certain places. But if you go through the way I just did, and you don't just look at notes, but you analyze what fingers are on what notes, and then what fingers move to the next note. So for example, that C and E, when you go to B and D, notice 1, B and D are the next keys down on the piano. Notice it's also the next fingers down on the piano. So things like that can really help, I think, learn the piece faster. More tools at your disposal will help in the long run, making those realizations of what's happening beyond just reading all individual notes on the page. Now, the only thing left, which really there isn't that much to, are the dynamics and the expression. You can see the big legato markings, the long slurs. So obviously this whole piece is very smooth. Wherever the melody is, you want to bring it out. Now, when the hands play together, it looks like the right hand has the melody. When the hands play together, that's what I'm seeing throughout the piece. So that means you want your right hand in those situations to be a little bit louder if possible. It does start at mezzo forte, and then it becomes forte at measure 16. I will leave that up to you. I think the First Noel does very well on a softer scale. So if you want to play the piece soft, I would grow. I would allow 16. Beat 3 of measure 16, right? Because that's where the chorus is. I would want that to be stronger. That's sort of the climax. So you want that to be a little bit louder. But that's the only volume change. And then it fades out at the very end, and you have a fermata. So at the very end, you're just going to kind of let that fade away. But that's pretty much it. I mean, there's not a whole lot more to the piece beyond that. So I want to go ahead and play it for you. And then I'll talk a little bit about the duet part in just a second. So I'm going to give you a count off and come in on beat 3. So 1 and 2 and... Yeah, so obviously you want to play it really smooth, as smooth as possible. Um, I don't know if I've talked much about phrases, but when you look at the first legato marking, it starts at the very beginning. Notice that it ends with the first half note there at the beginning of measure 4. And then we start a new legato marking on the words was to certain. So these are called phrases, musical phrases, sentences, if you will. Now, if you noticed in my playing, I played very smooth all the way through this entire legato. But right here, when I get to measure 4, right here, you see that little pop, that little break, that little breath? If someone were to sing it, they'd put a little breath there. They'd have to catch their breath. But this is also musical phrasing. And a lot of times with a lot of instruments, and even piano, it's nice to have that little break because you're accentuating, one phrase and bringing out another phrase. And that's kind of nice rather than all of it just running together. It sort of almost feels like a musical run-on sentence at that point. So you want to have those little pauses. You want to put that little pop in there. And it's very brief. I'm not taking any extra time. I'm just coming off beat. I'm coming off that half note a little bit sooner. I'm still coming on the C and the E on beat 3. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1. So you could even say I'm off on the and I end up putting a little eighth rest, which is pretty common. Pretty common, actually, that a lot of times when someone takes a breath, especially singers, it is usually for about half a beat. That's pretty average. So in case you were wondering, now do you have to do that? You don't have to. But it will make for better music, and that may also answer why you noticed I was doing that. So I definitely recommend you do it. At the same time, don't feel the pressure to have to do that this early on. But I think it's something at some point you definitely want to explore. Now the duet part, I'll have two separate videos, and I'll have the links below in the description. I'll have one where I just play the piece kind of like how I just did, and that way you can access it and not have to scroll through this video to get this to hear it again. And I'll have a second video that has a duet part, and in the duet part I will play it once at a slow tempo, so that way you can get used to just playing with the duet part. And then, of course, I'll have the performance speed. So at that point, once you're comfortable, you can play along at the faster tempo. I will note, and I'll note this in the video too, or in the description at least of that video, that the solo part comes in on 3 and. But my duet part, if you notice, where it says duet part, the first incomplete measure there is only a quarter rest. And the duet part's written a little differently, by the way. It's all written on the bass clef, but they've got low notes for my left hand, high notes for my right hand. So if you're wondering about how does that work, that's definitely for another day. But the point is that you play by yourself. When you get to the G on beat 1, that's when I'm on beat 1 as well. But again, I will explain all that in that video as well. Okay, so that's basically it. So in a way, you get a little bit easier lesson, I feel like. There's nothing new that you're learning here, except, just another really pretty, really nice Christmas piece. Remember, use after page 49 in the book. I don't have memorized what that is, but essentially, just be comfortable with the middle C position, playing sharps, in this case, F sharp, and being really familiar with that dotted quarter note rhythm. And that basically covers it. Everything else is pretty standard. All right, so have fun with this piece. I'm glad I'm able to get a second lesson in before Christmas, and hopefully I can keep them coming, and look forward to doing the next one with you guys. So any questions, comments, suggestions, anything at all, please leave it in the comment section below. I love reading feedback, and certainly ask me good, tough questions. I love being challenged, and sometimes you guys will say some things that are new for me, and that's just part of being a teacher. The wonderful thing about being a music teacher is a lot of what we learn as teachers come from great questions from students, and honestly, everything I'm teaching you right now, of course, I learned notes and rhythms when I went to school, but I've been teaching since I was honestly in high school. And a lot of my knowledge and experience now comes from a lot of questions, because then they force me to think and answer them. And then it's just more information that I can share with the next student. So I love how that works. How there's so much to be learned just from you guys. So any questions you ask, I love it. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. If you get a chance, follow me on Patreon, Piano Mountain. I'm also on there. I haven't really posted anything on there, but I know a few of you guys are now starting to leave a little bit of a monthly membership donation, which I really, really appreciate that so much. I love doing what I'm doing, and I'm going to keep doing it as much as I can. And again, I thank you guys. So have fun with this piece, and I'll see you next time.